6 things that happened after Jesus died. This veil or curtain was not an ordinary piece of fabric. It was a massive, thick curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. In the temple structure, the Holy of Holies was the innermost and most sacred area, believed to be where God's presence dwelled. Only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement after elaborate cleansing rituals and sacrifices. Leviticus 16, 2-34. The high priest would offer sacrifices for the sins of the people, symbolizing their need for a mediator between themselves and God. Several figures are central to understanding the significance of the veil's tearing. Likely the high priest at the time, Caiaphas, would have been one of the few permitted to enter the Holy of Holies. To him and the other priests, the tearing of the veil would have been a shocking, frightening event. The tearing from top to bottom suggests divine action, as no human could have done this. God himself was removing the separation that had existed between himself and humanity. The disciples and followers of Jesus, though not physically present in the temple, the disciples would later understand the event's significance. Jesus, often referred to as our great high priest, Hebrews 4:14-16, had sacrificed himself once and for all, ending the need for yearly sacrifices. Jesus' followers could now directly access God's presence through him, without any intermediary. For the religious authorities who opposed Jesus, this event was likely deeply unsettling. They had long maintained the rituals and the priestly order, enforcing the idea that people needed a structured hierarchy to reach God. But with the tearing of the veil, God's presence was symbolically open to everyone, bypassing the temple authorities and their strict regulations. In the book of Hebrews, the tearing of the veil is later understood as symbolizing Jesus' body, torn for us, opening a new and living way to approach God, Hebrews 10:19-20. This event marked a dramatic shift in the relationship between God and humanity, allowing all people direct access to God through faith in Jesus. 2. Darkness covered the land, and an earthquake shook the ground. As Jesus hung on the cross, a mysterious darkness fell over the land from noon until 3 in the afternoon. This event is described in all 3 synoptic Gospels. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. Matthew 27:45, Mark 15:33, Luke 23:44. This darkness, which lasted for 3 hours, would have been an unsettling sight for everyone in Jerusalem and surrounding areas. It symbolized the gravity of Jesus' sacrifice and foreshadowed the judgment he was bearing for the sins of the world. Several key figures would have experienced or been impacted by this supernatural darkness. Mary was present at the crucifixion, watching her son suffer and die, John 19:25-27. The darkness that descended would have amplified the sorrow and confusion she felt, seeing her son, the one she had been told would save Israel, dying in apparent defeat. The unnatural darkness underscored the gravity of the moment for her and all who loved Jesus. The soldiers tasked with crucifying Jesus, including the centurion who commanded the execution, witnessed the darkness and were struck by it. For these soldiers, used to carrying out executions, this was unlike anything they had seen. Later, the centurion, after witnessing Jesus' death and the supernatural signs, exclaimed, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54. The darkness and subsequent events seemed to open their eyes to the extraordinary nature of the man they had crucified. Many religious authorities, including the high priest Caiaphas, had campaigned for Jesus' death, believing him to be a blasphemer. The unnatural darkness that covered the land during Jesus' crucifixion must have caused at least some unease among them. They were familiar with prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures associating darkness with God's judgment, Amos 8:9. And this might have led them to question if they had misjudged Jesus. Many in the crowd may not have been direct followers of Jesus, but were drawn to the spectacle. When the darkness came, the mood would have shifted from morbid curiosity to fear and awe, leaving many questioning what they were witnessing. Some were later seen beating their chests in grief and confusion as they left the scene. Luke 23:48, as if realizing the true weight of what had just happened. After the darkness lifted, the Bible describes a powerful earthquake that shook the area, causing rocks to split apart, Matthew 27:51. This earthquake was another divine sign, echoing moments in Israel's history where God's presence or judgment was accompanied by an earth-shaking event. Just as God had appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai with an earthquake, Exodus 19:18, the quaking earth now announced the death of Jesus, the Son of God, marking the turning point in God's plan for humanity. The darkness and earthquake served as profound, awe-inspiring signs that this was no ordinary death. Instead, they revealed the cosmic significance of Jesus' sacrifice and hinted at the world-changing power of what was about to come, his resurrection. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more Bible's greatest stories. 3. The tombs were opened and holy people were raised. One of the most curious and powerful events following Jesus' death is recorded in Matthew's Gospel. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Matthew 27:52-53. This passage, though brief, describes a miraculous event that signified Jesus' victory over death and foreshadowed the resurrection hope for all believers. Here's a closer look at the key details and the figures likely impacted by this extraordinary event. The saints who were raised. The term saints here refers to faithful Jewish men and women who had lived righteous lives, obedient to God, and had since died. These individuals were possibly well-known figures in the community, likely respected and perhaps even revered. Their resurrection was a visible demonstration of God's power over death, tied to Jesus' sacrifice and foreshadowing the eventual resurrection of all believers. This was an early sign of the new era Jesus' death and resurrection were ushering in. The people of Jerusalem, after being raised, these resurrected saints entered Jerusalem and appeared to many. Matthew 27:53. This means that people in the city actually saw these individuals who had been dead, likely recognizing them as those who had passed on. Their appearances would have created a significant impact in the city, especially among people who may have remembered them. Such an event would have stirred both awe and fear, making the reality of Jesus' resurrection power undeniable. For the disciples who were initially devastated by Jesus' death, the appearance of these saints would have provided reassurance and hope. Though they might not have understood everything immediately, seeing these risen saints would have strengthened their faith, encouraging them to anticipate Jesus' promised resurrection. This sight, along with other signs, prepared them to grasp the fullness of Jesus' mission and the promise of eternal life. The religious leaders and Pharisees. For the chief priests, Pharisees, and other religious leaders, this event would have been both shocking and troubling. They were familiar with prophecies of resurrection, especially in books like Daniel, which foretold that many who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. Daniel 12:2. They likely had heard rumors about these raised saints or had witnessed their appearances firsthand, confronting them with the possibility that they had seriously misjudged Jesus. This resurrection of the saints was more than a miraculous occurrence. It was a foretaste of the final resurrection for believers and a powerful testament to Jesus' divine authority over life and death. Through this event, God was proclaiming that Jesus' death was not the end, but the beginning of new, everlasting life for all who would trust in him. After Jesus died, a profound statement came from an unexpected source: the Roman centurion and the soldiers with him. They had been responsible for crucifying Jesus and maintaining order at the execution site, but the supernatural events surrounding Jesus' death profoundly impacted them. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that the centurion made a remarkable confession. Truly, this was the Son of God, Matthew 27:54, Mark 15:39, or as Luke puts it, certainly this man was innocent, Luke 23:47. To understand the depth of this event, let's delve into the details and the significance of this moment. The centurion was a Roman officer in charge of a group of soldiers, typically overseeing about 100 men. Roman centurions were hardened, experienced, and trained to carry out crucifixions without emotion. This centurion was no exception, likely having witnessed or participated in many crucifixions before. His responsibility was to ensure that the execution went as planned, preventing any interruptions or attempts to rescue those being crucified. His authority and experience made him a figure of unquestioned loyalty to the Roman Empire. Throughout the crucifixion, the centurion and his soldiers witnessed a series of inexplicable events: the darkness, For 3 hours, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the land. Matthew 27:45. This was an unusual phenomenon that would have caught the centurion's attention. The Romans believed in omens and signs from the gods, and darkness in the middle of the day would have been unsettling and perhaps even interpreted as a divine warning. Earthquakes were not common in the region, and the timing of this one would have struck the soldiers as deeply unusual. Such powerful natural events in Roman culture were often seen as signs of divine displeasure or intervention, adding weight to what they were witnessing. Jesus' behavior on the cross stood in stark contrast to most condemned criminals. He showed remarkable composure, forgiveness, and compassion. For instance, he prayed for those crucifying him, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke 23:34. He also assured the repentant thief beside him of paradise, Luke 23:43, and expressed care for his mother's future by entrusting her to his disciple John, John 19:26-27. This calm, gracious behavior must have impressed the centurion and his men, who were accustomed to seeing criminals struggle, curse, and resist. Seeing Jesus' manner of death, the darkness, and the earthquake, the centurion declared, "Truly this was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54, Mark 15:39. This statement was profound for several reasons. A pagan's confession of faith. The centurion was likely a Gentile, possibly even a Roman pagan. For him to proclaim Jesus as the Son of God was highly unusual, and for the Jewish people present, astonishing. He was acknowledging that this man, crucified as a criminal, was of divine origin. This recognition broke cultural and religious barriers, demonstrating the universal reach of Jesus' mission and sacrifice. This confession is a powerful moment in the Gospels, showing that Jesus' identity as the Son of God was being revealed even to Gentiles, fulfilling prophecies that he would be a light to the nations, Isaiah 42:6, Isaiah 49:6. This Gentiles' acknowledgement echoed a theme found throughout the New Testament, that Jesus' message was not only for the Jewish people, but for all humanity. The centurion was not alone in this experience. Matthew notes that he and those who were with him feared greatly and shared in his confession, Matthew 27:54. The soldiers likely followed their leader's example, also recognizing the supernatural nature of what had happened. Their awe and fear marked a dramatic change, especially considering they had earlier mocked Jesus, Matthew 27:27-31. This confession by the centurion and his soldiers underscored the cosmic significance of Jesus' death. Though they had been his executioners, they became among the first witnesses to recognize him as the Son of God after his death. Their proclamation foreshadowed the inclusion of Gentiles in the New Covenant, signaling that Jesus' sacrifice was indeed for all people, regardless of nationality or background. This moment exemplified how Jesus' love and sacrifice could transform even the hardest of hearts, fulfilling the prophecy that every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, Philippians 2:10-11. 5. Jesus' body was taken down and buried. After Jesus died on the cross, his body needed to be handled according to Jewish customs and laws concerning burial. This solemn act was carried out by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy and respected member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, who had secretly become a follower of Jesus. This event is detailed in all four Gospels, Matthew 27:57-61, Mark 15:42-47, Luke 23:50-56, John 19:38-42, and each account provides a fuller picture of the care taken to honor Jesus in his burial. Here's a detailed look at the people involved, the significance of their actions, and the customs observed in the burial process. After Jesus' death, Joseph of Arimathea, who was both wealthy and a respected council member, went to Pilate to ask for Jesus' body, Mark 15:43, Matthew 27:57. This was a bold and risky move for several reasons. As a member of the Sanhedrin, Joseph had likely been present when Jesus was condemned to death, though Luke's account specifies that he had not consented to their decision and action, Luke 23:51. By asking to bury Jesus, he was publicly associating himself with someone the council had condemned, risking his reputation, wealth, and position. Approaching Pilate, the Roman governor, was a dangerous act, as Pilate had just sanctioned Jesus' crucifixion. Typically, the bodies of crucified criminals were left unburied as a public display or thrown into common graves. Yet Joseph respectfully requested that Jesus be given a proper burial. His courage and devotion were remarkable, as he was willing to take on potential personal consequences to honor Jesus. Before allowing Joseph to take Jesus' body, Pilate needed confirmation that Jesus was indeed dead. He called for the centurion to verify this, and once the centurion confirmed it, Pilate permitted Joseph to take the body. Mark 15:44-45. This careful verification is significant as it ensured that Jesus was truly dead, removing any doubt or rumors that he might have survived. Another significant figure who assisted in Jesus' burial was Nicodemus, a Pharisee and a member of the Sanhedrin who had previously come to Jesus at night to inquire about his teachings. John 3:1-21. In a striking display of faith and respect, Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight, to anoint Jesus' body, John 19:39. This large quantity of spices was characteristic of a burial fit for a king, symbolizing the honor and reverence Nicodemus held for Jesus. Following Jewish burial customs, Joseph and Nicodemus wrapped Jesus' body in clean linen cloths with the spices, as was customary to preserve the body and honor the deceased. John 19:40, Matthew 27:59. This act of wrapping and anointing the body reflected great respect, and the quantity of spices used was particularly lavish, demonstrating the depth of Nicodemus's devotion. Joseph placed Jesus in his own newly hewn tomb, which was located in a garden near the crucifixion site, John 19:41. This tomb had never been used, fulfilling the prophecy in Isaiah that the Messiah would be with a rich man in his death, Isaiah 53:9. The tomb was carved out of rock, which would have required significant wealth to construct, further reflecting Joseph's status and his sacrificial act of giving his own burial place for Jesus. The stone and the women who watched, after laying Jesus' body in the tomb, Joseph rolled a large stone across the entrance. This stone served as a seal, both to protect the body from animals and grave robbers and to ensure privacy, Matthew 27:60. As Joseph and Nicodemus completed this act, two women, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, likely Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, sat across from the tomb, watching as the burial was completed, Matthew 27:61, Mark 15:47. These women had been faithful followers of Jesus, witnessing his death, and now remained present at his burial, likely grieving deeply and uncertain about the future. According to Jewish law, burial had to be completed before sundown, as the Sabbath began at sunset on Friday evening, Luke 23:54. With the Sabbath approaching, there was limited time to perform an elaborate burial. However, Joseph and Nicodemus worked quickly yet respectfully to ensure that Jesus received a proper burial according to Jewish customs. This burial process was deeply significant. Jesus' burial in a rich man's tomb fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah 53:9, which foretold that the suffering servant would be with a rich man in his death. The manner of his burial showed that even in death, God's plan was being carried out with precision, affirming that Jesus was indeed the promised Messiah. The burial preparations, including the spices brought by Nicodemus, were reminiscent of the burial customs for royalty. Jesus' followers, though mourning, treated his body as they would that of a king, emphasizing their belief in his divine identity, foreshadowing of the resurrection. The stone sealing the tomb would later be rolled away, not by human hands but by divine power. The careful burial and the watchful presence of the women ensured that, when Jesus rose, there would be no doubt about his resurrection. The sealed tomb and its eventual opening would serve as a powerful witness to the miracle that was to come. Through Joseph and Nicodemus's courageous actions, Jesus was honored in his burial, even in the midst of what seemed like a tragic end. Their acts of devotion and the careful preparations for Jesus' burial set the stage for the ultimate victory over death that would come on the third day. 6. The chief priests and Pharisees secure the tomb. After Jesus was buried, the chief priests and Pharisees took extraordinary measures to secure his tomb. Concerned about the possibility of his disciples stealing the body and claiming he had risen, they went to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to request a guard for the tomb. This incident, detailed in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 27, 62-66, reveals the anxiety and disbelief of the religious leaders, as well as their determination to prevent any further influence of Jesus after his death. Here is a closer look at this event and its theological significance. The day after Jesus' crucifixion, which was the Sabbath, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate. Their request on the Sabbath was unusual, as Jewish law traditionally forbade public business on this holy day. However, their fear of what might happen at Jesus' tomb drove them to break with custom. They approached Pilate with a specific concern. "Sir, we remember how that impostor said, while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.'" Matthew 27:63. The term impostor shows their continued disdain for Jesus and their refusal to accept him as the Messiah. The chief priests and Pharisees didn't believe Jesus would actually rise, but they were worried that his disciples might try to steal the body and claim he had risen. This deception, they feared, would make the last fraud worse than the first. Matthew 27:64. Their use of the word fraud reflects their belief that Jesus' claims were false. Ironically, their efforts to prevent what they saw as deception would actually serve to confirm Jesus' resurrection. Pilate, though likely uninterested in the theological implications, granted their request. He told them, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you can." Matthew 27:65. It's unclear if Pilate provided Roman soldiers or simply permitted the Jewish leaders to use their temple guard. Either way, the guard stationed at the tomb would have been authoritative, adding a level of security that should have been impossible for a group of disciples to overcome. To make the tomb as secure as possible, the chief priests and Pharisees did two things. The tomb was sealed, likely by stretching a cord across the stone covering the entrance and securing it with clay or wax at each end. This seal would bear the Roman or Jewish authority, signifying that breaking it was a serious offense. Anyone attempting to open the tomb would be visibly tampering with the seal, alerting guards or onlookers. The guards posted at the tomb were tasked with ensuring no one tampered with it. These soldiers, trained to follow orders under threat of severe punishment, would have been vigilant, knowing the consequences of failing to secure the tomb. For the disciples, who were few in number and frightened after Jesus' death, challenging an armed guard would have been unthinkable. The chief priests and Pharisees' efforts to prevent a false resurrection ultimately became some of the strongest evidence for the truth of Jesus' resurrection. By securing the tomb so thoroughly, they removed any doubt that his body could have been taken by human means. When Jesus rose and the guards reported what had happened, the religious leaders had no plausible explanation. The sealed tomb in the presence of guards became, ironically, a powerful witness to the reality of the resurrection. After the resurrection, some of the guards went to the chief priests to report what had happened. Matthew 28:11. They told of the angel's appearance, the stone being rolled away, and their own terror. The religious leaders, realizing the implications, bribed the guards to spread a false story. "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep." Matthew 28:13. The leaders promised to protect the guards from repercussions if Pilate heard of this. Matthew 28:14. Despite the miraculous events the guards had witnessed, the bribe convinced them to spread the story that the disciples stole Jesus' body while they slept. This account, though, is problematic. It implies that the guards would have been asleep on duty, a punishable offense in the Roman army, and that they somehow knew who stole the body even while sleeping. This account became widely circulated, yet it was full of inconsistencies, further reinforcing the implausibility of any explanation other than the resurrection. Jesus had foretold not only his resurrection, but also the opposition and disbelief it would provoke. Earlier, he had declared, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah." Matthew 12:39-40. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus was in the grave for 3 days. The religious leaders' actions, rather than preventing Jesus' influence, helped fulfill his prophecy and affirm his victory over death. This episode highlights the intense efforts of Jesus' opponents to discredit his claims, even after his death. In a dramatic turn of events, their actions would end up confirming the miracle they sought to suppress. The sealed tomb, guarded by soldiers, stands as an enduring symbol of Jesus' triumph over human and supernatural forces alike. Even the strongest earthly measures could not stop the divine power that would break forth on the third day. God bless you.